Hi everyone. Welcome to this second episode of post discussions that we've started off hosting on Aaina. So this is a new format that we're trying out in which we pick out a theme and then pick out one of our posts related to that theme and discuss it among our team members and then take you through the ideas and processes that went into bringing the post together in a bit more detail. Just like last time, today we have all team members joining. So I'm Shruti, and we have Vrinda, Nidhi, Sayan, and Sakshi. Um, really excited for this second episode, mainly because the theme of the discussion is around academic literacy, which is a theme that we find quite important at Aina, and many of our posts also do directly deal with this theme and also touch upon it tangentially as well. So, we're going to be discussing one post in particular. My question to start off this conversation is, what is academic literacy to you? What is something about it that is not highlighted enough? And why should we be making it a much more highlighted and emphasized conversation in all higher education spaces?
Yeah, so academic literacy would refer to many, many things. It would refer to reading, writing, listening, speaking within an academic space in registers, languages, and forms that we call academic. And of course, there's a lot of debate around that too, and there are many differences based on disciplines. But broadly, I think that's what academic literacy would be. And when anybody comes into an university, a student comes into an university, they are participating in a set of practices which involves, let's say, reading in certain ways, writing assignments in certain ways, producing knowledge in certain ways, which all of which we consider as within academic literacy. Um, I think we don't talk enough about this in a way where we really sort of point out, okay, this is the exact style of reading you have to do. It's like you come into a discipline and you participate in the rituals of the discipline. You come to classes, you read your books. Suppose you're studying sociology or history or literature or whatever, and you are supposed to be slowly gathering and building a certain style of thinking and expression. But it's not always spelled out how it exactly happens, what are the smaller steps that you take to make that happen, and also what it does to you, right? And how it shifts your thinking, how it shifts your identity, and so on.
Adding to that, like my big reason for why academic literacy needs to be talked about more, needs to be brought to the fore more, is uh, just how damaging it can be morally and emotionally to students who are just coming into college, um, and not being able to read, write, and speak in this expected uh, way and assume this expected sort of embodiment, especially in a country where higher education mostly happens in English, and English is not just a medium, it's like a language of aspiration, reverence almost. So I think the consequences of not being able to be academically literate are like far reaching, really damaging. So it should like be at the top of our priorities to talk about.
And like adding to that, I also feel like a lot of the ways in which aspiration or like desire broadly is changed changed or formed within higher education spaces. Like academic literacies are quite central to that, in that in all these micro practices, they eventually do represent, say, forms or modes in which students can relate with or engage with knowledge. And this is both like official prescribed texts, but also knowledge in other forms, right? Like going into rabbit holes, just reading about some things, or learning about, say, campus politics through different informal routes and sources. And whether or not, so the kind of inequalities that are prevalent in terms of both access and dominance of certain literacies, that ends up really shaping who wants to do what also. So there's a question of who gets to do what, who gets to study, who gets to research, etc. But also, how is desire being shaped, or desire agency, how are these things being shaped by differential access or different relationships to academic literacy, is also something I feel very curious about. Yeah.
Hearing all of you, also thinking about what Shayan was saying earlier, in the sense that academic literacy can be experienced in so many different ways, and even feelings of finding it intuitive or being able to pick it up easily versus really struggling with it. Even within that, there are so many considerations for students, and something that we try to talk about in our posts also, that academic language really lands on different people very differently, and there's a need to look at it a little more precisely also, even when we talk about exclusion and privilege in that sense. For example, I think for me, I haven't had that much of a history of struggle. Sometimes things have felt intuitive, or um, so being able to deconstruct that, and how come I find it easier, is also really important to be able to understand and build a sense of, I guess, like the hope is to build a sense of belonging in the classroom.
Um, I was thinking about different forms of writing that seem to be evolving now. And I'm thinking about things like creative and critical writing, which are supposed to be, a little bit of a stray from your academic writing, but are equally considered important narratives in your academic journey. And I'm thinking about all these different forms of writing and platforms that are coming up with digital publications, things like that, that have their own aesthetics also. And we do kind of, we're very quick to celebrate how accessible they make a lot of things, but I don't think a parallel conversation about how new inequalities are being reproduced on these platforms or in different forms of writing are happening at the same speed. So I think like a conversation about some of those problems which are sustaining throughout is very important when it comes to academic literacy.
Yeah. So the post that we've picked out to discuss today is in particular uh, on academic language. It's titled "How Do Students Relate to Academic Language?" So we'll try to take you through it and take you through the process and the ideas that went behind bringing this together.
Shayan, would you like to summarize the post?
This is a conversation between three characters, three, higher ed students. And, these three characters are trying to sort of convey different types of relationships with academic language. But any relationship with academic language is also, in a sense, a relationship with the university, with disciplinary practices, and with sort of this broader idea of academic literacy. And the character on the left, she starts by saying that I don't get why academic papers are written in such a pretentious language. The guy in the middle says that academic language gives us the vocab for conveying nuanced ideas. So clearly, like, there's a difference in position between these two characters, right? The character on the left starts from this idea that, oh, why is it written like that? And it's a very kind of common thing a lot of people say. Why is it so complicated? It can be said in simple language. And through the post, we kind of show how her opinion is kind of shifting a little bit, through what others are saying. The person in the middle is somebody who clearly aligns with it, uh, even with the institutional idea of like academic language being important, serious. Uh, and he sort of presents some justifications for why, he feels academic language is important. But that also gets, I think, shifted and challenged a little bit through the post. And finally, the character on the right, I think is somebody who struggled with academic language, but also has arrived at a more nuanced understanding of academic language and is kind of mediating this conversation in a sense between the two of them. and it brings out sort of the problems of inequality in particular, and how relationships to academic language are very different, based on where you're coming from and how you're participating in universities. And you can see that the person on the left, says that I'm nervous to use the words in case I am wrong, and feels like the same things could be said in plain language. And then the person on the right is trying to make a case, no, that will dilute the idea that you're trying to convey, and academic work requires serious language. So he's trying to make a case for why this is a specialized language and it's different from more colloquial, everyday, or social media language, right? And I think this is also like we are trying to, I think, make fun of ourselves also here. And the person on the right then says that, like, okay, maybe you need a shared vocabulary for concepts, right? And these are theoretical concepts, so you need to kind of develop jargon. And of course, all the jargon has been created over like decades and years of research work and theoretical work, but it can't be used as a signal for superior ideas. And from here, I think the conversation shifts towards thinking of the relationship between academic language and holding power. And the person on in the middle says that people pay more attention when I write in this language, right? So that's a motivation to write in it. And the person on the right sort of complicates this, saying that nobody understands this more than people who have been kept out of these spaces, particularly marginalized communities, and says that, okay, when finally I could express my ideas or my experience through academic language, I felt heard, it gave me power. But the motivation is not to sound smart, right? It's really about thinking and meaning making and making sense and building, a critical inquiry, and thinking of like ways in which we can rethink the world, right? And says that in my thesis, I want to do it in language that's more lucid, more simple, more accessible. And finally, the person on the left can see like also goes through a journey here and says that, okay, maybe I need to find academic work that's personally meaningful, rather than looking at it as distant. And the person on the right says that at the same time, it's not an individual quest. We also need to teach it in a way that's better, and more democratic, and so that everybody can sort of access the tools of academic language, but at the same time question and expand how we speak and write, so that it's not just one standard of academic language. So broadly, this is the post. These are the ideas. Would love to hear, like what all of you think about the ideas in the post. What are your reflections?
Yeah, there's just one thing that immediately like popped up to my head, and it's related to what Nidhi talked about, how some people find it easier, some people pick it up more easily. And this is what Shayan also like mentioned in what he said. I think it's somewhere in like the second or the third slides where this girl says that we're just expected to know. So the idea that academic literacy or like academic language, like your command over this kind of language, needs to be kind of matter of fact. It's not something that is that is that you kind of work towards, or like or something that takes active effort. I think that is very important to highlight, because that makes it very difficult to even have conversations on how to actively build ways to learn it, or like actively build curricula to like work towards picking it up, rather than picking up happening in a sort of automatic kind of way. That also reminds me of how in college you're expected to know, and in college if you take like remedial English language classes, it's not like something that is something that it's something that you would hide, that you're like ashamed of. But in school, for instance, if you were taking like an extra English language class, that is something that makes you like a student that's seeking more, or student that's like has a thirst for learning and stuff like that. So I think it's also important to go back to like schools and how differently they like usually frame language learning, and then how there is like this disconnect between schools and how they treat language learning, and then how colleges expect, like higher education spaces expect uh, this command over academic language right off the bat the moment you enter college.
I think for me, when we were making this post, there were two main sort of motivations. Um, One motivation was to sort of explore this idea of what are the different ways in which people are relating to academic language. And um, there is a lot of powerful work that people, academics, also scholars or activists have done using some of these concepts in rights-based work and so on. So how do we kind of have a more holistic understanding of what academic language can do, or what certain concepts can do, where is it helpful, where is it not helpful, unnecessary, and also how do we think about creating accessible, inclusive environments, and also producing knowledge that, like Shine was also saying, like uh, everybody can access and understand, and at the same time, we're not ending up gatekeeping certain concepts that, at the master's level especially, is important for people to be able to learn, rather than just saying, oh, because this is jargon, we're not going to like we are going to focus on something else entirely, while the people who are saying this have access to that and have had a lot of experience and have, arrived at this place where they're just having this ironic distance. So I think that was the main motivation. And the second motivation was that I felt like we behave, and I think this is something, even while making the post, we went back and forth on, is that when it comes to a feeling of disempowerment with academic language or jargon, it's expressed in very personal terms, like, oh, I feel nervous, or what we've also had have spotlighted in the post, like, I feel nervous, or I don't understand it, I feel like, why should we write things this way because I'm not able to access it. However, when it comes to ease, and this is something we were struggling with, the guy in the middle makes a lot of universal points, like, oh, academic language is important because xyz, whatever. So just sort of balancing that, even people who have ease and comfort with academic language have a personal history with it, because of which they're able to feel this way. And it's not just that only the more marginalized people have these personal histories or whatever, right? So being able to have everybody in the conversation make personal claims and personal stakes and emotional, like show a particular kind of emotional relationship with academic language, and at the same time also be able to make universal claims to, okay, academic language needs to be this way because of xyz reasons, and everybody getting to participate in that conversation also. So we've kind of, I feel like, tried to bring out both of these threads in what the characters are saying.
Responding to something both of you mentioned, which is just this sense of, which like is a bias we had also in the beginning while drafting this post, what you said, Nidhi, which is this sense of classifying the default as someone who knows it already, right? Like this, we are just expected to know. Somehow that person who navigates it with more ease, or like at least in the outward expression of it, has a lot of effortlessness, and that effortlessness also gets to be valued, right? You don't want to say grade, for example, you don't want to grade for the most improvement across drafts, you want to grade towards like, okay, the most, like the best draft itself. Sometimes something that like that increasingly has interested me more in this post also is just this: we really need to teach it better to everyone, but also question and expand how we speak and write. how do we imagine a teaching of academic literacy itself while we have to also use it to question the status quo in some ways, and also not put it on a pedestal, right? So it's like you have to teach something that's not super defined in the first place, but you also don't want to teach it as it is used dominantly, which is either to just maintain certain power structures often, or to like individually or institutionally, or there is the more hand waving of like, oh, this is not important, right? So if we have to think of slightly more transparent and empowering ways, so it's not just for someone who's disempowered, but for someone who is whatever misusing the literacy or for only for power, how do we teach it towards that direction is something I'm increasingly more curious about.
Uh, I'm also thinking about how standard texts, standard quote unquote texts are texts you're meant to approach. But when you form your own understanding of what academic, writing is for you, and you pick your audience and you pick the kind of writing you want, you make your writing so that your writing approaches people. So I think there is a very crucial difference between how texts that are seen as, texts that you must know, must read, are texts that, you are supposed to approach. And that journey of approaching that text is sometimes very unmediated by professional help from a teacher who is kind of helping you throughout the way. Or sometimes there is, peers who will be like, oh, I know this text and I feel kind of proficient in it. And then that sense is also there. So there are different things about approaching the text that kind of make the process very like different for people. And that's why, again, it's also a personal journey, as Nidhi mentioned. So yeah, I think a part of academic literacy then is also having your own engagement with it. And then I'm thinking about how we can bring that engagement to the classroom. Like the way you think about academic writing. I think that's also a good way of teachers having this engagement, of scholars having this engagement on what they have come to, how they've reckoned with academic writing in a way.
Just wanted to add something that I feel like when you talk about academic literacy is like a way of learning something, right? So, there was this one slide here, and Vrinda, this is also referring to your point that how to make it more transparent, as you said. But I'm thinking like how to really talk about the purposes and functions of reading in a certain way or thinking in a certain way. So there is that one slide where the guy in the middle says that you know we need a certain specialized language. Can you go to that slide, Iqbal? Yeah, like we need serious language for academic work. Now, of course, he's not saying it in a manner that's very specific, and I think this whole idea of what is serious and non-serious also needs to be challenged. But what we do in academic literacy, for example, something like argumentation, right? Something like, okay, abstracting, moving from the specific to the general, um, you know, sort of working with multiple ideas and trying to see the connections between them, right? I mean, these are mental tasks, these are emotional tasks, these are also done through language. Um, but each of them have particular functions. I mean, they are able to generate knowledge and learning in particular ways. And I feel like that is often not explained, right? So even if you take any academic text and you look at one paragraph, I mean, there is a summary, there is a description, there is evidence-based reasoning, there is sort of conversation with different sources. Uh, there are also different tones being used. I mean, there might be authoritative assertion, there might be irony, there might be, sarcasm, there might be doubt. And I feel like each of those elements, which are doing different things, are not sort of demonstrated very effectively.
Adding to what Sakshi and Shayan said, lots of very interesting points. I was also thinking of Vrinda, your question about how do we then kind of engage with academic language in classrooms and how do we teach it, etc. I was thinking about what I want to do and try to do with students, and two, also hunting and thinking about what my teachers have done that's sort of helped. I think one thing is, I mean, this conversation about approaching a text, right? I feel like people also have very different relationships and emotional experiences of what happens when you're not understanding something. I also find reading academic work, even now, a very laborious exercise. It's sometimes uninspiring, and it has felt daunting and intimidating also in the past, and still does, depending on what we're reading. But I feel like uh, the default emotional response is very different for people who have a certain sort of tendency to ease and comfort with it, and people who have more of a relationship of intimidation. Because people who are already intimidated by academic language tend to think that it's them, right? Like, I'm bad at this, or I'm wrong, or I'm not smart, and that's why I'm not able to understand something. I know this is bringing it back to reading a little bit, um, but otherwise, if there is a little bit of comfort, there's also this sense of, I don't know, like in my experience, there is this sense of more easily being able to say that, hey, can this be written differently? And saying that, okay, it's because something's up with the text. Even that is, of course, acquired over time, but it's quicker getting there for some people. So I feel like something that's helped is to just soothe those things and invite effort with wrestling with texts and being really specific. So if there is this like assumption of, oh, this is easy and I understand it, how can we like wrestle with it a little bit more? How do we infer from this text? Like, what practices of inference are you engaged in from what's written in the text, and is that accurate and rigorous? Are you putting in effort there? And if there is this reaction of intimidation, then sort of trying to also place onus on the text a little bit wherever relevant. That's been one way. I don't know how helpful it is, but I think what's helped, Shayan, similar to what you were saying in terms of examples of teaching that I have really picked up things from. Um, yeah, just going into specifics, not treating anything as too kind of like, too simple for the classroom in that sense, or too easy for the classroom. I shouldn't have to be teaching this, like not having that attitude. Teachers who've focused on, like, just projected one paragraph on the screen, and kind of guided us through, um, like very kindly guided us through what are the um, moves almost that the author is making, or just even at large thinking about building blocks of social science knowledge of, like, okay, if there's this big theory that someone is saying, like, where are they getting this from? What might have been some of the pieces of evidence they have used? How have they put these evidence together? Like, if they've observed something and then they've read something and then there's all of this stuff happening, how does that become theory? Like, just demystifying that and not treating it as mysterious and like, it's requiring some kind of superior higher order thinking, but actually just this like very rigorous process of looking at what sources we have. I think Shine also mentioned this, and then saying that, okay, what are the ways we can synthesize this, all of this information, and what comes out of there. So that has been helpful in terms of being able to see a path also for that kind of literacy. Yeah, those were just two things that came.
Uh, just want to quickly add that this idea of also being able to get comfortable with the text, or just being comfortable with the idea of getting academic literacy, also has to come from teaching it in a way where it's not coming from specific sources. Like the sources that you can potentially become academically literate from are multiple and they don't look like a text or a classroom or a very specific kind of discussion in a classroom. They could be a conversation you have with a friend and you could be touching the same pulse the text is touching. Or you could be in a debate and you're learning certain skills and you don't have to speak that formally and you are understanding a process of argumentation while you are doing that. So getting like or pointing towards sources that can potentially help people and that people are more comfortable with. It could be a conversation you have with your family members. So those things can also kind of, help like rein in people and be like, you're already engaging in practices that, you're already like there. Like this is not as inaccessible as you think it is. So that's also helpful at one point.
We've had some good ideas on how this could be made better in terms of making it more inclusive, making it not as inaccessible, at least showing that it is not as inaccessible as it might seem to be. But what are some ways of teaching or quote unquote interventions that are very prevalent in higher education spaces that you guys, all of us, have been in that don't work at all, that are really, they do the opposite of what they intend to do, or maybe their intentions are even completely misplaced.
I think one of the things that, like, and this is also responding to what Sakshi said, that there's a need to sort of like widen what we think of as an academic source itself, or like a source of academic learning itself. I think when that's not done right, like, there's one kind of way of supposedly teaching academic writing, which I've seen more in research settings, not in huge classrooms, which is just like, oh, read these five theorists and you will know, right? And it's also one, it treats knowledge as very internal to the text itself, right? So it's just like no sense of it being relational or social at all. But the other thing that I think it ends up promoting is this desire to imitate a certain style of writing and indirectly a certain style of reading also, right? Because you're supposed to read and just gain something invisible from it, like in this weirdly spiritual, I don't know what sense, but like it'll just come to you. And what that does is that and I think I have also faced this like in disciplines I've been less comfortable with than my current discipline, where it suddenly feels like, oh, I have to write like this. And that's not a positive aspiration, it's a very subtractive aspiration, right? Like one feels like doing that form of imitation, not because, oh, you just think that you appreciate that style, just because you think that style is correct. So this like extra prescriptive mode, I feel really doesn't work.
I immediately thought of like shame and shaming, which I have seen happen a lot, where there's this like huge environment of fear and intimidation created around things you're supposed to write, or papers you're supposed to submit, and assignments and whatever. Um, and it's also the lower, right? Like just that, oh, this class is like really, really difficult, and it's, the professor is really strict and all of that. It starts from there and then moves into specific forms of grading and assignments that really induce, I mean, like try to beat the undesirable quote unquote practices of reading and writing out of you. Um, just because, they have to meet this standard before they send the students off to the next semester. I don't know what it is, but I assume that's what it is. But yeah, this environment of like really kind of ripping apart people's writing and setting that environment of shame and penalty around uh, even trying to say something or to write something, that's really worked horribly.
I'm thinking of how there is a certain anxiety about teaching how to think when students come in. that there is a very, like teachers or like just generally the atmosphere can be keep. Now we have a set of students coming in. They need to know how to read a text, and there is this anxiety about we need to forcefully kind of teach how to think instead of working with what might already be there in terms of how some of those processes, which may not look exactly like how we've come to understand academic literacy, students are already kind of doing that. So it's kind of like you need to break down everything you know about thinking, and then you need to learn it anew, and the process of learning it anew is this prescribed format. So I think it stems from a little bit of like an anxiety to teach how to think instead of assessing where you're at and what you're working with.
Yeah, so I think to kind of bring this conversation to an end, maybe one final question regarding the process of creating the post itself again. What I remember that there was a lot of back and forth on this post. The one of the posts on our page that took a really long time to actually get out there. So what dilemmas did we have while bringing this together, and what are some points that you would include now that you maybe couldn't for various reasons?
I think I remember when the post was being made, I was really not defending, but uh, I was trying to give more credence to what the middle guy was saying, and I didn't want him to be caricatured.
Yeah, I remember that, and I remember, yeah, definitely agree that like the common sort of attempt was to not make him sound like a caricature, and I think most of the conversation on this post was about this guy, and because yeah, the caricature is also not very useful, because it again still doesn't explore. We could have represented him in this like, oh, I am really smart and intellectual, and I'm going to say things that are totally defending uh, the traditional mode of academic thought or whatever. But it's not very helpful because then nobody would want to identify with him, or he would be read in this really unsympathetic way, and like it's really unclear what that's for, like what is that in the service of. um and yeah, I think the sort of the point we were also trying to make is that a lot of that is coming from a his dominance, and also b the fact that he has recognized that he receives some sort of esteem when he talks in that way, and talking in that way in class or whatever, writing in this way is his way of holding on to or making sure that people give him esteem. And I think that's the critique we're making, right? And yeah, just to figure out how do we move towards a pedagogy of kindly exploring and investigating academic texts and ideas, and in a way that's fun and nice but also serious and intense when it needs to be, and so on. That was also in some ways what we were trying to highlight. And so uh yeah, that's also why we kept going back to the personal for him also, because uh I think my thing was that he can't just say universal things. He has to say what is it doing for him, like what emotional effect is it having for him, what is it enabling him for him socially, or not enabling for him, like whatever. So just like what are his personal stakes in defending academic language also needs to be clear. And he says something like that, right, that oh, I'm taken more seriously when I'm when I talk like this. And like that's really the meat of the matter, right? Like that's gets to the core of why we relate to certain kinds of language in the way that we do. And that also then puts all of the characters on equal plane of like everybody has personal stakes, and some people are benefiting, some people are not benefiting, and then we want to see where we want to place academic language how do we want to go about this like effort also that Shine was talking about, this immersion in academic language. And I think that's the reason we got the first person also to move, like you also summarized, have that arc of like, I mean, we could have also easily created a post where she doesn't have an emotional movement towards academic language and she just says that okay, texts need not be written this way. But we also wanted to sort of have a conversation where people also maybe get curious about, okay, maybe there's a particular field or a particular style of writing or a particular set of thinkers who people are drawn to. So I think just, yeah, like how do we move towards that teaching and learning environment where it's about curiosity and it's about demystifying what that learning process is, and sort of doing it without shame and without also holding on to this dominance. Like that is the long term work that I think we all also struggle with, right? So I remember that being, I mean, also some of these things in hindsight I can see that those were the what we hoped were the takeaways.
Somewhat tangentially related to this, but something I wish we could do in the post, and I realize we can't because I think this is one of the longest posts, and it would have really been like a serialized novel if we had done anything else. And this, but was also to show that journey from like this, like, or to show the difference between just okay, academic language, not just as a set of like terms or styles of writing, but as like critical thought itself, right? So not just something that you have to do in a university, in a space of higher education broadly, but rather like break down the different elements of it also. So while we are showing personal stakes, also show what it represents in a societal sense also. In so how do arguments, or why, how do arguments get formed, why do they matter, or how they translate into this personal relationship, I think we couldn't show as well. Perhaps that's more doable in a space where we focus more on one character and are more specific in terms of what they're working on. So we can also give examples of text arguments, histories of those arguments, and how, yeah, how they've even been used in different places, as you were saying, Nidhi, earlier. Yeah, so that's something I wish we could have or like can explore later also. Yeah.
I would also be interested in exploring how plain doesn't have to be like an antonym of like, jargon or like complex writing, and how like there are ways of communicating ideas in simpler language that have been impactful in terms of building complex ideas and representing what different people think, what different scholars before whatever you're writing have thought. So yeah, I think exploring that and not making that a binary is something that would also be interesting to think about.
I think for me, like, I wasn't super involved in the making of this post, but overall, I think we're making the tone of the post, if you just like skim through it, is that we're broadly making a case for why academic language is useful, and what are some of the problems that people face while acquiring this academic language, while acknowledging the limits of the concept itself and the limits of how it is being taught, and even the limits of how we think that it needs to be taught. I think that last part where he says we need to expand how we think of academic language, we need to question. I think that is something, if my memory serves me right, is not something that we have talked at length about in our posts. I know it is a very difficult part of this entire topic, but I think that would be good to explore in the coming months. So that's it. Yeah, thanks so much for hanging out with us today, and see you soon in the next episode. Bye.